Hello, and welcome to the Executive Exchange, the official podcast of the Executives Club of Chicago. I'm Dorri McWhorter. I'm the president and CEO of the Executives Club of Chicago, and I am thrilled to be here today with Jason Zimmerman. Jason and I are going to have a conversation about culture. And before we begin getting into the details of that, Jason, just introduce yourself and give us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jason Zimmerman, I run a company called Threefold Collective, which is sort of an allusion to kind of two different things. The first is it's the start of exponential growth, which, as we'll talk about, that's where I think culture really plays in, is if you want to get to a 1 + 1 = 3, for instance, culture is, I think, the biggest place to start. It also alludes to the three parts of my background. So I began as a PhD in economics. So I was a researcher. That's where I got my beginning. I had an advisor tell me that I should maybe go out to the real world and get some experience and understand the messiness of economics as it kind of shows up. And that way, when I go back into the classroom, that the experience that I bring will help not just with the research, but with the teaching side of it. And long story short, I never finished my PhD. I went into the real world and stayed there. So I did mergers and acquisitions for about 10 years within a strategy consulting firm. And then I went and ran special operations for a Fortune 500 organization where I got to get sort of the research to strategy to execution side of it all. So those three elements have combined to help form Threefold Collective and sort of the cultural and organizational advisory firm that we run.
Wonderful. And so when you describe your background, you may have officially finished your PhD, but you still got a PhD mind, right?
Right.
And
I hope so.
And in economics and thinking about the application of that. So why would then you focus on culture, which, as we know, culture gets sort of described as one of the soft things and those things that are not quantifiable and not sort of the hard, real stuff like finance and numbers and economics.
Right.
So how would a PhD in economics go to focus on culture?
Yeah. So as I started getting into kind of the messiness of the real world, doing government research up front, I happened to get connected with some guys who came out of the University of Chicago. And this is really when I think behavioral economics really started coming into the forefront. And what that really meant, traditional economics basically says that everyone has a rational decision to them. And of course, as everybody knows, everyone listening to this podcast knows, like, we are not rational creatures, especially when it comes to numbers, to money, to anything of that nature. And so I got really lucky to do some published research around kind of the behavioral side of economics. And that thread extended into what I was doing was the post-acquisition world at first. And so we were looking at, when you take two companies and you combine them together, how do you get that to integrate? And of course, I mean, the research shows that anywhere between 75 and 80% of those acquisitions, or any strategy really, will fail. And it will fail principally at that point of integration. And so from our side, we were asking, what is that? And from my mind, looking at sort of the behavioral economic side of things, so looking at not just the psychology, but also looking at the sort of incentives, if you will, the trade-offs that people are making in those decisions, it got me questioning, like, why are people resisting potentially something that could be good for them? And of course, there's tons of research out there now, and obviously tons of experience that we bring, but economics was never, I think, meant to be a rational, calculated type of economics. And actually, if you go back into the history, I won't bore you too much with it now, but it actually started out more as a sort of behavioral side of things. And it was only later that it became more math-based. And so we're kind of getting back into our roots. And so it's that's how I began, really, with the economics. It's about incentives. It's about drivers. It's about trade-offs. And those are very irrational decisions that people make.
Yeah, and it makes sense because ultimately the economics are actually driven by humans' exact behaviors, right? So it's important to understand sort of what then that catalyst is. So let's take a step back and describe, though, when you say culture, because culture is, again, one of those words that everyone has their own definition or feeling or meaning behind it. So when you're thinking about culture and the strategy and how it is relates to economics, how are you defining culture?
Yeah, it's a really good question because it is a little bit ambiguous. And even if you look it up, if anyone listening Googles this right now, you'll come up with maybe 4 or 5 different academic definitions of culture. What I think brings it all together is a feeling of the beliefs within a system, which will drive the behaviors that people take on which inform the actions that people take. And it's those actions that will tell an organization whether it can produce the outcomes that it's looking to take. And so if you kind of just keep going back into that thread, from actions to behaviors to beliefs, it's that system of beliefs. And what's really interesting is, and I think everyone here kind of knows this as well, but you can't declare a culture. It's not something it's not a proclamation necessarily. It's something that people will look at and observe. And a lot of people listening they'll know it and recognize it when they leave a company. They'll start to see how that company, once they step away from it, they'll see how that company sort of, shaped their beliefs, behaviors, and actions. But when they enter into a new company, they're going to look at those things. And so culture is, and I think where it becomes ambiguous, where it becomes nebulous in people's minds, is one, that connection isn't always clear. But it's not something that you can directly pull on a lever and say, I want to pull this lever and I want to get this outcome to it. It's a little bit more indirect. And I think for that reason, it becomes kind of this soft feeling. And one of the things I'll talk about maybe a little bit later is some of the math that's actually coming out of academic circles right now called network analysis actually allows us to measure kind of the fundamental elements of, let's just say, connection, of how people relate to each other. So communication, trust, all the things that might inform us on culture, we can start to measure. And so, from a standpoint of a consultant or from someone, running, execution on the inside, what gets measured gets managed. And so that's what's really important.
We'd like to take a moment to thank Shure Incorporated for being a proud sponsor of the Executives Exchange podcast. Shure is the gold standard trusted by podcasters, musicians, and broadcasters around the world. Whether you're recording at home or in a professional studio, Shure microphones deliver clear, reliable audio every time, meaning fewer distractions, better conversations, and a more polished experience for your listeners. Visit Shure.com to explore their full range of products for home use and professional media needs. So let's start working towards that journey as you described, because your fundamental work is that you believe that culture is a competitive advantage.
It is, absolutely.
And so how does that begin to take shape in terms of looking at those elements of culture to be able to say, we can create this, therefore we can win on this?
Yeah. So let's go with kind of another academic study out there. And if culture is misaligned to strategy, and what I will call, if you have a fit for purpose culture, meaning it's fit to the strategy that you want, and we think about sort of those actions that we're trying to drive, research will show that if strategy and culture are misaligned, you will lose 30 to 40% of your productive capacity. And
okay, say that again for the people in the back.
Yeah, so...
But they need to turn their radio off.
Let's put it in different terms, right? So if strategy and culture are misaligned, 30 to 40% loss of productivity. So for every $1 million, right, that you put into labor, into operations, into systems, you're potentially getting back only $600,000 for every $1 million in productive capacity.
So therein lies the phrase culture eats strategy for lunch.
Yeah.
Or at least 30 to 40% of that.
Yeah, right. It can be a huge cost driver. Yeah. And so if, if you're looking at that, it doesn't show up clearly, right? But, costs will go up. Your speed will go down. Innovation will start to dwindle. And it may not always be super clear to people why that's happening. But I mean, if you can start to think about culture in a different way, and you can start to align it, and you can start to, empower people to make the decisions where the information is on the ground, then, I mean, you can get back a much higher return on the investment that you're putting into the organization. And a lot of that is driven by, if people are listening to this, they might, begin to think about, like, where does that might, show up, for instance. It's going to be in bureaucracy. Right. Yeah. And policy that it might be, too onerous, right? It might show up in, people looking for information that they may not have, right at their fingertips, right? Or asking questions or not knowing who to go to. And the idea is that within a culture, and especially the larger it gets, the more complicated it gets, obviously, but it's not insolvable at, I've shown it, as large as 15,000 people, but the idea is to make that as connected and as tight as possible. one really good example that's going to be in the news right now is SpaceX. So I think about this. They, at the time of our recording, at least, there's rumors that they're going to go IPO later this summer, and at the current valuation, they should be at $1.5 trillion. Which, when I think about this, and I'll talk about sort of how SpaceX is structured and how they can do that across their large company. But you look at Elon Musk, and he is the CEO of how many different companies? And two of those, if SpaceX goes at this valuation, are going to be inside the top 10 largest companies made. And he is a part-time CEO at all of these. And what he's able to do is he's able to take his way of thinking, his system, and he's able to put that into the organization so that he can show up at Tesla, so that he can show up at X, so that he can show up at SpaceX, at the Boring Company, and produce the same results time and time again. And the way that SpaceX and Tesla and all of them are currently structured is in order to exchange information freely where the information is at and where people can make those decisions. And so decisions are made inside the team, and they're only escalated when they're insolvable. And when you think about sort of that 30 to 40% loss of productivity, right? I mean, that's now the bureaucracy. How do I go to this meeting and go to this, board discussion, right, and get this consensus? And that is stripping away some of that productivity. And of course, it's again fit for purpose. So we need to make sure that we're designing for the right outcome. But depending on what it is that you're looking for, speed, right, or resiliency, you're going to have a different kind of setup. You're going to have a different set of beliefs, a different set of behaviors, and a different set of actions that drive that.
I can appreciate that because one, as a CEO, you think about your role is just having that vision and then working with your board and your leaders to get that right strategy. But when, every framework I've seen with every consulting firm says vision, mission, strategy, objectives, initiatives, metrics, none of them for the framework says culture.
Right.
So what are the components then, if we have this strategy, to say that we need to, as much time we're spending on developing the strategy, how then do we create, what are the components of creating that fit for culture, fit for that particular strategy, culture that drives that? Because that is such a great example, as you talked about with SpaceX and Tesla and Boring Company and sort of those affiliated. There is a system there that's driving those types of companies. And you're right, it isn't the CEO being present there every day that's driving that. There is that culture or that system that is clearly supporting how those companies are able to move and grow value and, quite frankly, be competitively standouts in their different respective areas.
Right.
So how do you do that? So what are those components of culture that ultimately drive how you get to that strategy? And truly, and I go back to, if strategy means how we compete, then culture ultimately then becomes that underlying foundation for being that competitive advantage for any company.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, as any good economist will say, the answer depends. And I think that's coming from the big bulge bracket firms myself. I mean, we always had a framework and a template that we would always kind of push out there. And, I think that helps really shape the way that a lot of decisions can be made. But I think where it came, or where it can break, and sort of where my role as, special operations director came in at is closing that gap. So again, I'll go back to that 80% failure rate. It's a really high failure rate when strategy tries to get executed. And I think part of it is that we need to really think about just how information flows throughout the organization. And that's almost always going to be my very first starting point. And from there, and you can construct, and like I said, we can measure now how information flows, or more importantly, where it gets stuck within an organization. And if people don't have the information to make a decision, or if they're making a decision on half information, for instance, let's say that, your company has created a new strategy, right? They need to pivot. They need to be more nimble in the in the space that they're operating, right? Then if that information doesn't flow all the way through to the organization, and if people don't know the actions that they need to take in order to combine, with, other folks inside the organization to drive that outcome, then they might be making information somewhat blinded or somewhat handcuffed in that. And so there is a communication element. There is an information side that needs to be there. And like I said, I think if trust is going to be a huge component of that. And trust is, just to take a moment to define trust, is it's not a feeling. It's more of an observation. It's more about coherence. It's, can the company or will the company do what it says it's going to do? And there's a really good example around this in terms of like learning, right? And I'm going to bring this into another example for us here in a second. But if a company says that it is a learning organization, which I think a lot of us will say that's part of the mission that we've seen, that's part of the values that are on the wall, right? But the moment that a mistake happens, you almost always see somebody looking to point the finger.
Absolutely.
And if you find what happened there, maybe you're going to add 2, 3, 4 different layers of bureaucracy so that that mistake never happens again. But if we go back into SpaceX, for instance, or if we go back into, Apple at the moment, these organizations will make these mistakes, and it's not so much that they're celebrating those mistakes, but they're not looking for blame. They're looking for lessons learned, and they're looking for ways to move forward. And that is another element of, not just information spread, but trust. So employees will look at that. And again, you can't declare that we have a learning culture. They're going to look at what you say and what you do. If you say we have a learning culture, but you actually look for blame, then that coherence is broken. And that's going to determine how quickly information spreads across the organization, and whether it spreads with a certain level of quality and, finality and clarity and all that sort of stuff. So if you look at, when you kind of combine and sort of turn the knobs at different levels within an organization, I always go back to kind of Lockheed Martin and Skunk Works, right? So this is a huge aerospace company, and they have this massive production arm where they're going to build, fighter jets, commercial jets, everything else. But then they have this Skunk Works division, and they are completely separate, but they both have different strategies, and they both have different missions, and they're both designed completely differently. You have Skunk Works, which is really designed for innovation. And then you have the manufacturing arm, which is really designed to kind of mitigate risks. And what's happening over here is you're going to have, at the Skunk Works side, you're going to have incredible diversity of thought. You're going to have engineers working with accountants, working with propulsion guys, working with just various different mix of it. And they're going to help solve problems that are creative, that are brand new. And it's designed to sort of spread that information, that informational diversity really quickly, really easily, have high trust. But then on the other side of the manufacturing arm, where you're not looking for innovation necessarily, you're trying to get more consistency in operation. And so you're going to have less diversity of thought, and you're going to have, manufacturing parts, doing wings all consistently day in and day out. And it's a little bit more like, little I innovation. And so you don't want a lot of diversity over there. The interesting thing about those two things is you're both going to develop speed as kind of an outcome of that, right? But you've designed these for two different worlds, and they performed that perfectly. They designed those perfectly. You see that Apple does that now, right? So for a lot of their innovation, they have a separate unit specifically designed for it. Some of the things that we did at my firm is we did the exact same thing. We created a separate innovation arm because we could play around with those dials in a different way. That was a long-winded answer. So
no, it wasn't long-winded at all. It actually had, but well, if that was a long-winded answer, I'm about to give you a long-winded question because there's so much to unpack there.
Yeah.
So a couple things. First of all, I really appreciate your conversation around being a learning organization, because one of my favorite Dorriisms, it's bad when you quote yourself, but one of my favorite expressions is that I make no mistakes. I just have plenty of unplanned learning opportunities.
There you go.
But I say that, but I really do try to create a culture where I want people to learn from those supposed mistakes. And mostly is that if we all had perfect knowledge, then everything would be right. So by default, none of us knows everything. So everything we do is learning as we go, right? And so how do we continue to reinforce that so that it becomes part of our culture? There's a piece of what, though, one of the things you said made me think about, as we look at how we shape culture and, well, first, again, how we decide what strategy we're going to have. Therefore, then how do we ensure that we're facilitating?
Yeah.
And I say facilitate because I feel like it's still, although there are definitely components to it, that it still takes work and it takes some nurturing to get there.
Absolutely.
But where do we keep the space then for some of that? How much of it is truly organic then that happens? Because you do hire, I won't say the right people, but you hire people and people then come with their system of beliefs.
Yeah.
So how much time do you take ingraining your beliefs in them so that you get the behaviors, that you get the actions?
Yeah.
So how much of it is truly organic versus how much of it do you really have to ensure that you are creating and being more intentional about?
Yeah. Really good question. So let's look at kind of an example.
That's why they let me be the
yeah,
host.
right. Learning opportunities, right? It's a question we hear a lot, and it's a hard one to explain, but it's an easy one to kind of recognize.
Okay.
And I really like to look at Microsoft, especially when Satya Nadella took over, right? And so, I mean, this is a 200,000 plus employee organization that, you not only have a history that, Microsoft brought to the table before he took over, a really competitive, kind of cutthroat technological organization. And then he comes in and he says, maybe not directly, maybe not his words, but he says, I want to have a learning organization, right? And he wants teams to work more collaboratively together. He wants them to produce more innovation. And of course, as we saw just this quarter, Microsoft has produced, I think the largest profit in some time recently. And so what he did is working. And the way that he did it, the way that he made that shift over the years is he modeled it himself. So again, if we go back to trust, we don't necessarily need people to agree with what we have. We just need it to be predictable. And so what Satya Nadella did is that he modeled the behavior that he wanted demonstrated. And so that was empathy, that was learning. And so he didn't make any proclamations across the organization. He basically showed up and with his, the people that he talked to, he demonstrated it. And people started organically just paying attention to it. Again, it's the beliefs and the behaviors that drive the actions that produce the results. And so people started modeling that behavior. And what's really interesting about sort of how when you model this behavior, this comes from James Fowler and Nicholas Christakis, their research, that behavior and ideas can spread up to 3 degrees away from where you are. So you don't have to be in the room with Satya Nadella, seeing his behavior in order to feel that. And the reason that happens is that, one of his direct reports will then go to their teams and they'll start modeling that behavior. And then they'll start modeling that behavior down to their teams. And when you get a certain level of reassurance or you start to see this multiple times, in fact, the number is typically around 25%. It's not as high as most people would think. But as you start to see that, as in, and again, you never have to be inside the corporate boardroom, you'll start to model that behavior yourself. And so it's definitely, I like the word you used, it's going to be much more organic. And it's not something that I would necessarily say, you don't want to make that proclamation. It will help, if your values from the trust side of it. But it's really about just the consistency in modeling that.
So that could be good or bad, right? Because there's an assumption there that you have a leader that comes in and maybe want a certain culture, therefore they demonstrate that culture.
Yeah.
And one could say, that's good if they have the right orientation.
Yeah, right.
The people are different.
Yeah.
So there is no such thing as one good culture or one bad culture.
Right.
That's why I really appreciated the alignment between your strategy and your culture.
Yeah.
Because there could be a world, and would love to hear your thoughts on this, where you would have someone that comes in, for example, when you gave the Lockheed Martin with the manufacturing arm, that they have a very specific type of strategy, therefore the outcomes they expect, therefore a different type of culture there.
Right.
Not good or bad, just different.
It is
right.
Weird. Yeah.
But when does that particular style of leadership or culture that is it just misalignment, or are there different styles that there truly is not one good or bad style? Because I'm getting to the behaviors that were like, oh, that person's not a good leader. They're mean. They're this. They're short. They're direct. They're blah, 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 blah.
Right.
But that actually may work somewhere.
Yeah.
It may be okay.
Right.
But when we see those examples, is it misalignment of culture and strategy, or is it just that they're not good humans?
Well, it may always be a mix of both. I mean, as a behavioral economist, there might be.
But some people have argued that there's certain direct, we can go back into, the late 1900 types of companies that were very successful. I would argue that those companies and those leaders are very different than what we see today.
Absolutely.
And that worked at that time, right? But when does it not work? So that's I'm trying to align, like, is there a certain set of cultural standards, I guess, that are just good?
Yeah.
And are there sorts of cultural standards that just don't work regardless?
Yeah, it is a good question. And it, like I said, any good economist will always tell you it depends.
Of course.
And I mean,
so you're a good economist, so we know it depends.
Yeah,
what do you think?
Exactly. It's always a nice escape clause for me. But that's why I like to use the phrase fit for purpose.
I like that.
Right. And it's whenever we go in, right, and we'll look at an organization, we will always start with the results that they want to produce. And depending on what those results are, that's where we're going to help them begin to think about the culture that they need, again, to shape those behaviors, beliefs, and ultimately the actions that they drive. And again, you can kind of think about two ends of the spectrum of Lockheed Martin, for instance, as a really good example. But within there, and I think this gets to the point where we bring trust back into the equation.
Okay.
And again, trust is, I'm not defining it as a feeling necessarily.
Right.
I'm defining it as coherence. And so you might have, looking at sort of the psychology of people as long as I have too, there are, folks that might have ulterior motives, right? And that's neither good or bad, but if it breaks that coherence, if they say, I want a learning organization, but they do something radically different, then that trust breaks.
Right.
And when you have that trust break, that coherence breaks, that predictability of I don't know how they're going to respond, then what you're going to get is you're going to get that 30 to 40% dip in productivity. And so one of the things that I kind of, especially with cultures, it's always easy to look at when a culture breaks versus when it's working well, right? And when it's working well, it's hopefully going to disappear kind of behind you. Right. And the system is there to support you, to support the decisions, to support everything that's happening inside that organization to produce those outcomes. But if it's not, right, and the values really come out under stress. And so if an organization is stressed for any reason, financially or, just market position or anything else like that, the first thing that always breaks predictably is going to be collaboration. And it's going to be that sort of connection. So if we go back almost more than 100 years ago now, Francis Galton came up with this wisdom of the crowds idea. And what he and all the research has today predicted is that it started with at a county fair, as a little bit of a history of this. It started at a county fair. And basically he asked everyone in the crowd, no one was an expert in this, but just said, guess the weight of this cow. And no one person really got anywhere close to it, but collectively they all got almost within like a few percentile of each other, of the right answer, of what that cow actually weighed. And so the research has predicted over time that when you have this diversity of thought, that a group of diverse thinkers, I don't want to say amateurs necessarily, but just broad thinking, can produce better results predictably, consistently than a group of experts. And so for me, when I look at a culture and it starts to break down, when trust or coherence starts to go, like I said, collaboration is the very first thing that's always going to break. And that's also when you need collaboration the most. And so it takes a really strong leader at that time to step up and make sure that collaboration, that trust, that consistency is still there. Because that collaboration, that diversity of thought, that sort of creative engine that's back there, that's what you need to get out of the situation that you're in. And as I kind of mentioned, it's all about, if there's one word that I want people to kind of take away from this, it's the word connection. That's culture in a nutshell. And it's how people connect. And it's how information gets, transmitted across the organization. That, as I said, if you're looking at sort of 1 + 1, right, and you're looking at that equation, if you're losing 30 to 40% productivity, I mean, you're less than 2 at this point. Mm-hmm. But I'm claiming that we can get you to 1 + 1 = 3. We can get you to drive exponential outcomes. And that's where we can look outside and we can look at SpaceX, right? We can look at, Lockheed Martin. We can look at Microsoft. We can look at what Apple's doing. And we can say, like, these are, companies that are producing outsized, results. And at the heart of it is connection.
This is so powerful, and we can have part 6 of this because there's so much here. So with a leader coming into an organization, so it's a couple questions. Yeah. One, sometimes you have a leader in an organization that there's a new strategy and either that culture aligns with that strategy or not. Yeah. Right? And so there's actions and so I want to hear, let's start with that one. What happens? You're in an organization, you have a new strategy, but you have a culture. Yeah. Right. The culture may not align to that strategy to actually get the outcome from that strategy. And so you're on a 3-year strategy. How far is culture lagging to get that strategy to where it needs to be? Yeah.
2 really good things there too is you got to talk about sort of the personality of the group itself. And where I typically work, almost every project we have both me kind of looking at the system, and then we have one of my partners who is kind of an executive coach, if you will. Sure. And what's happening is we're kind of looking at both the personality to make sure, like we said, trust and coherence is there. But then you have me kind of looking at the system and how do people connect and how does the system kind of come together. And as almost the first thing we'll always ask, and anyone who's listening to this, I'm almost encourage them to do it, is go around their table, whether it's a boardroom or whether it's just their team, and say, privately, write down what are the results that we're going after. What are the top 3 outcomes that we want? And then before you move on, ask them to, what are the measures? How are we going to know that we got there? And I will say, I have never seen anybody say the exact same thing. I've never seen a team say the exact same thing. Yeah. And that's going to hopefully prove that something within that system, I'll say connection, I'll say communication, I'll say information flow, is misaligned. And it can be demonstrated really quickly and really easily within your own team. And that's the information that people are taking in order to connect into and drive the decisions that they're making. And so if that information is fundamentally at the root different, that's where we need to start. Okay. And so I will almost always begin at that level to say, what are the results that we're aiming for? And are we all in coherence? Are we all in agreement in what needs to happen there? And that's where we'll start to look at things. And so based on sort of my role and my partner's role, what we're going to do is we're going to look at both the individual personalities within it to make sure that, if they want to create a learning culture, that they're able to, model that learning culture, that they understand that. At the same time, I'm going to help create sort of the system, economically thinking, the incentives, the guardrails, the guideposts that will help to make those decisions and information kind of flow into the right spot. I don't know if I answered your question fully. No, you did.
Well, you did, because I continue to think that. So that's sort of an existing organization where you have the sort of same parts, so to speak. You have the same leadership, but different strategies, same people, different strategies. Yeah. So then how do you start to align the culture then to get that outcome? So you did answer that. Yeah. So thank you very much. Yeah. The other piece I have though, or not though, but a different question is that oftentimes when you have a new leader comes in and you're still trying to execute against the strategy, but then you realize that, this may not work because there is a culture here that exists that isn't going to allow that strategy to happen. Yeah, right. What happens then? Because I'm always of the mindset you can't switch out everybody. And so how do you actually build that? And what then would you need to do? It sounds like perhaps you're going to say, same thing, it depends. Yeah, it depends. However, so what does that look like though? As you have a new leader coming in and you have, that's the variable part. Yeah. And so now how does that happen?
Yeah, it is a great question because you're right. I mean, you don't want to economics and I think business and especially the CEO role, any decision-making role is all about trade-offs, right? And so what you're kind of presenting is a trade-off, right? And the trade-off could be, well, I can keep this culture and maybe the trade-off is going to be X, Y, or Z, right? Or I can replace the entire culture and I'm going to get a different sort of response from the system. And neither one are great. Where I like to start is think more about sort of the individual motivations that everybody has, right? And especially when you think about like an entire workforce of various different generations, right? Post-COVID, of whether we're in person or whether we're remote, these questions kind of all fit into, what kind of culture do we want and how do we want that to produce? What I like to think about is regardless of who you are, we all kind of want the same things. We all want to, feel valued in our role. We want to contribute meaningfully to what we do, and we want to feel respected and have the ability to grow in our role. And a lot of those things, especially if we think about like a remote work environment, for instance, again, I'll go back to the word connection. All of that is about connection. It's not necessarily about different rituals or different, norms that groups have. Those are secondary. Those need to be designed in order to elicit the certain result that needs to come out of it. And so when you think about sort of how people want to show up, people want to have an ability to express themselves in that way based on the skills and the contributions that they feel that they have. And our goal as managers, as CEOs, I believe, is in order to create the system that allows that to happen. And so whether it's a remote environment, so whether you fall on the side of Jamie Dimon where you need everybody in person, or whether you're in an environment, where it's more remote, the norms, the rituals, the system that you're going to create are going to look different in order to elicit the ability that people want to feel that they can, produce meaningful work, feel contributed, have the opportunity to grow and enrich themselves and enrich the company at it. So it comes down to this belief of people aren't stagnant. They're not stale in how they operate. They're willing and able to flex. As there's kind of a phrase that I use all the time that people don't resist change, they resist being changed. And so if
I'll quote you on that.
Please do.
Yeah. I'll quote myself. I'll quote you.
Yeah, right. I appreciate it. Yeah. And so, when I look at a question like that, I don't look at kind of a system or a culture as it doesn't have the ability to change or ability to be nimble. It's what sort of levers, again, as an economist, what sort of levers can we pull to elicit a certain response? And of course, as you mentioned, there are going to be trade-offs within that. I don't want to give the illusion that this is an easy thing to do. Changing a culture. Well, one of the examples that I do have, a client I can't necessarily name, but we were working with them and they needed to change their culture. And traditional consultants, places that I came from, said it was going to take 10 years. We ended up never changing the definition of success. We ended up doing it in 2.5 years. We changed it 4 times faster by looking at it, not from the traditional way that change happens, but through the sociological lens, through how people connect and how people think and how people are motivated. And by designing that system and allowing them to, as you kind of said earlier, to organically come back to it on their own, by not forcing change, but allowing them to sort of observe, model, change their beliefs, change their behaviors, change their actions, you can change it much faster than you think.
Whose job is that? Is that HR's job? Because it's people.
It is a great question. I came from HR originally, but I think it's the easy answer is it's everybody's role. I really think it really belongs with the COO. The COO in most organizations, and I'm going to, broad brush stroke this for a second, but they are looking at, again, those actions that will drive those results. And so to me, they're the ones that need to know how people connect into the systems that they're creating. And if they're not thinking about the human element of it, or if they're, I don't want to offend anybody, but if they're passing this off, to HR and saying that's your job, when it's really your job to make sure that people connect into your system, that there's coherence and trust and connection within that system, right? Then you're kind of doing a disservice to your organization.
Yeah, the way I could see it too, because the system is COO-ish,
Yeah.
but then the leaders are responsible for their people.
Yeah, exactly.
And so you sort of have that collaboration. And then, of
Right.
course, HR is also engaged there
Yeah.
as you think about sort of who needs to do what
Yeah.
to ensure that that culture actually delivers the outcomes.
Exactly.
But it does sound time consuming. So I appreciate your example.
Yeah.
Because as you think about the level of effort in understanding the people, and people are so varied,
Yes.
then but what you're focused on is the system, not the individual people,
Right.
but the people within then become part of that system.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, exactly. And I do think, and that's where I think specialties like HR will come in. They are looking at, when I was growing up consulting, we kind of took this from Freud, but we basically said everyone is kind of ego or greed, right? People either want, ego, so they want power, they want respect, or they want greed, they want money. And, I think HR can help sort of fine tune the system, but it is, I believe, the COO's role, even the CEO's role as well. I don't think they get a free pass here, but to make sure that the people within the system feel heard and, like I said, supported in order to produce the results that you want your organization. And again, I always think about it from a mathematical lens, just because that's where I grew up. But I mean, if I invest $1 million into labor, into systems, and I'm only getting back, 60% of that, right? And I can't really put my finger on what it is, where it might be bureaucracy, it might be just looking for information, it might just be, various different elements that we can't point to on a balance sheet. That's your culture. And so if you're the CEO, if you're the COO, if you're the CFO, you're responsible for producing, those outcomes for your investors, for, your people, for your customers, right? That's your job. And so I do think that culture is really the responsibility of not a sports system, but the people who produce the revenue in the organization.
So if we again sort of take a step back, I appreciate that the culture components in terms of what the driving the outcome is, the beliefs, the behaviors, and the actions. But you also said, trust and compassion are part of that.
Yeah.
Those are true sort of human qualities.
Yeah. Right.
So how do you bring all of those things together to then, at the end of the day, drive economic outcomes?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's the mix that we're trying to really perfect. And I mean, you said it, most of the time it's going to be difficult, and it's not an easy thing to do. And it does take a lot of having the right person in the right position in order to help seed that idea and to help spread it. And there are times where, maybe the people that we put in charge there aren't the right people for it. And we might have to make those hard decisions. But as custodians of an organization, that's partly what we have to make. And it doesn't have to be a rude thing. And I would encourage, I've obviously as an HR consultant, I've done that as well. It doesn't have to be, thank you, goodbye. It could be putting people in the right positions, right? And helping them find sort of where they're at and helping them get to a better place. And so, it's, we can model it, we can measure it, we can calculate it. But at the end of the day, we are all humans. We're all driven and incentivized and motivated by different things. And what we're trying to do is not to, claim that we're going to have a 100% track record. We don't. But if you have a 75 to 80% chance of success, if your culture is misaligned to your strategy, we're going to give those better odds. And we're going to be doing that by looking at these things in a different way. And so, yeah, it's still a tricky thing. I think we're all still sort of learning around it. It does take some personal sacrifice, right? And this is where I said I really partner with some executive coaches to really make sure that any blind spots that we might have as leaders, potentially a lot of leaders, and again, broad brush strokes here, we're all kind of type A personalities, and what got us here, why should we change that, right? And the idea is, sometimes what got us here isn't going to get us there. And so we also need to model that change and model that behavior. And so we do have sensitive conversations, if you will, tough conversations with leaders to say, this might be on you, and think Satya Nadella, if you want to make the change and see the results that you have, like it might start with you. And by starting with you, like I said, we can model that and it can spread up to, 2-3 different layers away. So it's tricky for sure.
Well, Jason, I so appreciate you. And what I'm taking away, you said Satya Nadella, I'll take away Gandhi, be the change you want to see in the world, or it's your company.
Yeah, so. That's right. That's right.
So I appreciate you and just look forward to continuing the conversation about culture. And I have to say, as a CPA, you're making me wonder, I'm like, is it goodwill or culture that should be on our balance sheet? So
yeah, exactly.
Particularly in M&A deals. So I appreciate you. And thank you so much for all the great work you're doing.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. To catch more leadership insight from some of the area's most innovative leaders, please join us. And if this sparks something for you, stick with us, follow the show on your podcast app, or subscribe on YouTube to keep the conversation going, and share this episode with someone who'd appreciate it. Until next time.